When I think back to the early 90s, I think of the time that I was leaving school and going to university. It was a time when I didn't have a mobile phone and I'd never used the internet. And it was a time of momentous events around the world, like the end of the Cold War. But it was also a time when people were starting to realise what was happening to the planet. The end of the Cold War was the start of humanity's acknowledged global struggle with climate change, then known as global warming. 31 years ago, in 1990, UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said, "The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations." Prime Minister Thatcher then went on to say, "Our immediate task is to carry as many countries as possible with us so that we can negotiate a successful framework convention on climate change in 1992. And that we did. In 1992, the nations of the world agreed to establish the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. It was a seat for common action on climate change, and the organisation was charged with organising an annual conference to discuss and agree on this action. 3 years later, in 1995, the UNFCCC organised the first Conference of the Parties, or COP, in Berlin. Dr. Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, inaugurated the ministerial segment of the first session of the COP and welcomed all participants to Berlin, the capital of a reunited Germany. He said that by the end of the Cold War, symbolised by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, also gave humankind a chance to tackle the great humanitarian task of the future, namely the preservation of creation and the maintenance of the sources of life. A quarter of a century later, the UK is about to host the 26th Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, or COP26. The stakes now are even higher than those identified by Prime Minister Thatcher in 1991. The Paris Agreement, negotiated at COP21 in 2015, is a binding agreement which aims to keep global temperature rises to within 2 degrees, or ideally 1.5 degrees of warming. The science tells us we must cut global greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 to have a chance of meeting this goal and avoiding catastrophic climate change. The world has already surpassed 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels, and we're seeing devastating impacts. Deadly fires, floods, storms and heat waves have shaken communities around the world, from Germany to Japan, and unfortunately including Thailand. Thailand is one of the top 10 countries most affected by climate change. We've seen this in the devastating drought of 2019 to 2020, the worst drought to hit Thailand in 40 years, and the floods that are still hitting people hard right now. Our thoughts are with those who have been so badly affected. Now, at COP26, our immediate task is to come together as a global community to slash emissions and to address the ever-present threats of climate change that are already here. We're working with every nation to reach agreement on climate action and to achieve 4 goals for COP26. First, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Second, to enable communities and natural habitats to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Third, to mobilise climate finance to help countries take action. And fourth, to work together to deliver climate action. This COP is the first significant test of the Paris Agreement. All countries are expected to reassess and increase their national commitments to cut greenhouse gases every 5 years. These 5-yearly check-ins, established by the agreement, allow us to monitor our performance against our goal to limit global average temperature increases to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to within 1.5 degrees. The Paris Agreement is binding. It brings all nations into a common cause. Now, at COP26, the world must honour the promise. It's our last chance to make the commitments that will keep 1.5 degrees alive. And it's not only up to governments to deliver on these goals. COP26 must be the moment that every country and every part of society embraces their responsibility to protect our planet. We must work together to achieve this. Businesses, universities, cities and individuals are absolutely essential. We need your innovation, we need your influence, and we need your energy on our side. Ahead of COP26, we're calling on organisations to join the Race to Zero, a UN-backed global campaign rallying non-state actors to take rigorous and immediate action to reduce emissions. Setting ambitious and credible net zero commitments sends the strongest signal to governments, markets, supply chains and consumers that businesses and other parties are also committed to the transition. The Race to Zero requires organisations to take robust short-term action to contribute to halving global emissions by 2030 and to achieving net zero emissions as soon as possible and by 2050 at the very latest. Businesses are truly a vital component of all our goals for COP26 and can help achieve success through your own action, working with peers and across your value chains and becoming positive advocates for climate action. Key to this is working with governments to let them know that you want stronger climate policy and a green and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. A key report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently showed that 1.5 degrees is still within reach. There has been progress. When the UK took on the COP26 presidency in 2019, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. Now, countries that are covered by a net zero or carbon neutrality commitment account for around 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and around 80% of global GDP. Thailand has said it aims to reach net zero emissions as early as possible in the second half of the century. Also in this region, Laos and South Korea have committed to reaching net zero by 2050. Malaysia, the same, by as early as 2050, and Indonesia and China have announced goals of net zero by 2060. But we need to do more, and we need everyone on board. The UNFCCC and COP processes were born in the aftermath of the Cold War, uniting the world under a common goal of defending the environment. Now, as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to come together once again for the good of the people, prosperity and the planet. COP26 is that moment.